Good afternoon, and it's always a pleasure to interact with the Sabbath School. Topic I'm going to discuss today is an area of discovery for me. Earlier last year, Dr. Rock asked me to participate in a Black History Month lesson study guide. And based on my research and preparation for my contribution to that, I just had these amazing insights as I did my own research for that. And so I recognized, realized, and discovered that much of what we may call Bible history is Black history, a history of Black and colored people. Let me begin to share my screen, and I actually have another a discussion to join at 3:30, so probably have to pop out of here by 3:30 to join that one. I told them I might be a little late, so but that one begins at 4. They begin to prep for it at 3:30, so please know that I'll be coming out of that. Okay, let's see what we have here to share. As you may notice here, the topic is Black history is Bible history. Now, what do I mean by Bible history? By Bible history, I'm talking about those historically described accounts in the biblical narrative. And when I say historically described, you must understand the genre of Bible history may be different from what we call history today. Maybe, all right? I'm not going in debate on that, but that's what I mean by Bible history. And the major question you ask here, where do Blacks figure or appear in these narratives? Now, I just want to give you a little sample of literature. A major work on that is edited by this African Heritage Study Bible, edited by Canaan Felder, one of our premier African-American, or would you say Black theologians in America. And of course, our own Keith Burton. Keith Burton is a well-known Black theologian, Adventism, taught at Oakwood College, now teaches at Adventist Health University down in Florida. He wrote this book, The Blessing of Africa. But this original African Heritage Study Bible is a major work of reference showing, highlighting the Africanism of the Bible itself. All right. Something is not going. All right. So the question I'm asking here is, how did the Bible with such deep historical and religious African roots come to have such little connection to Africa and its descendants? And perhaps the only Black history that many people or many Bible devotees are aware of is the curse of Ham. That's what most people, Black people, think of, or others. But I'm going to propose here that once we shed the racialized Eurocentric lens that has ignored the Africanism of biblical culture and history, it becomes difficult to separate the sacred writings from their African setting. So Canaan Felder, in that Heritage Study Bible, he makes the argument that although Europeans appear much later in the Bible history, the earliest people of the Bible could have been considered Black by modern Western racial classification. So this is what we want to do. We want to unload the imposed burden of race from the Bible, and we want to witness to a narrative that emerges from the non-racialized and non-segregated humanity. So that's where we want to go. Now, there are 5 points I want to highlight, not necessarily in this order in this presentation. The fact that the biblical narrative emerges from a non-racialized Afro-Asiatic context, that Africa is the seat of the Genesis creation story. The so-called curse of Ham is a racist imposition upon the text. The Caucasian depiction of major Bible figures, including Moses and Jesus, needs closer examination. The accounts indicate that these were at minimum of mixed race with strong African heritage. Other point I want to make is that Africans were at the forefront of the spread of the gospel. So let's look at the curse of Ham, where most people begin when they think of blacks in the Bible. And we see this text, when Noah woke from his wine and knew what his youngest son had done to him, he said, "Cursed be Canaan, lowest of slaves shall he be to his brothers." And he also said, "Blessed by the Lord, my God be Shem, and let Canaan be his slave. May God make space for Japheth, and let him live in the tents of Shem, and let Canaan be slave." So here we see then, we want to ask
Dr.
questions.
Hemmings, your slides are not changing.
They're not changing?
No, we are not seeing.
You're not seeing my slide?
Anything. No, we're still seeing the two books.
Oh my goodness, this is something. I'm wondering why. Let's see. They're showing to me. Okay, let's see. Let me see what's happening here. I will. Oh, me. Just give me 1 minute. Let's see what we have done. Screen. Let's see. All right. Are you able to see my screen now? Are you able to see my screen? Hello?
We can see your screen, but it's still just the two books.
Okay, let me start over and see where I went wrong. Let me stop share and let me start over again. So just give me 1 minute here. Let's see where we went wrong here. From current slide. See. Show. All right. All right, let's. There we are. Duplicate slideshow. Okay. All right. Okay. Let me start share again. All right. Share. All right. Can you see the screen?
Yes, so we can see it now.
All right.
Seeing Noah's curse.
Yes. So here we see. So here we see. So we read that whole point about that whole text about this curse, and here are some questions regarding this so-called curse. Who pronounces the curse? Who pronounces the curse? Is it God? No, it's Noah. Upon whom does Noah pronounce the curse? Not really Ham, but Ham's son Canaan. I don't know why he curses his son. Whom does God curse after the flood? God cursed no one after the flood. Whom does God bless after the flood? God blessed Noah and his entire progeny after the flood. So yes, these are some questions that have to arise concerning this so-called curse. Okay, I think we're still having a little problem. Okay, let's see. All right. So what has happened, what we realize here, are you seeing the next screen? Is everybody seeing the next screen? Hello?
We're seeing, may God make space for Japheth.
Yes.
Let him live in the 10th
So
century.
this is another part, the last part. Now, this has been interpreted from the context of the transatlantic slave trade. And Stephen Haynes wrote this book, Noah's Curse, and where it's used as a biblical justification of American slavery. It was appropriated, according to him, by American pro-slavery and pro-segregated interpreters. But it has absolutely no justification in the context. For example, why is the curse of a father of his grandson, of his son to his grandson, how that becomes a curse by God when God actually blessed Noah and his entire progeny? So we see it has been appropriated or misappropriated to justify slavery and segregation. So here are some problems with this racialized interpretation. The Egyptians were supposedly the descendants of Ham. Egyptians enslaved the descendants of Shem. So actually, the Hamites actually enslaved the Shemites. Not according, that is the opposite to Noah's so-called curse. Slavery was not based on race in the ancient world. People were not enslaved because of their race. They were enslaved because of their political and socio-economic circumstances. For example, when the children of Israel went down into Egypt, they went down there because of a famine. And down in Egypt, the political situation changed, your socio-economic situation led to that enslavement. It wasn't because of their race. It had nothing to do with race. So again, the question is, was racial segregation part of the culture of the Bible? It was not. We should never read that into the Bible. Hagar, for example, was an Egyptian. And when we talk about Egyptian in the ancient world, Egyptians, these were dark-skinned people, you know. The lighter hue of Egyptian today is because of intermarriage due to conquest and so forth. Sarah attempted to produce an heir for the house of Abraham through Hagar. Please note, friends, and again, a lot of people assume that Sarah was white and had a black slave. Sarah was not white. She was a colored person herself. And so, again, it shows how problematic is this racialized interpretation of the so-called curse of Ham. And so the point I want to make here is that the biblical narrative emerges from a non-racialized Afro-Asiatic context. Let's pull this apart a little more. Now, let's go back to the beginning. We talk about Eden. Now, we get some kind of insight into the geographical location of the Eden described in Genesis 1, or in Genesis account of creation, from the rivers that were described that flows out of Eden to water the Garden of Eden. It says the river flows out of Eden to water the garden, and from there it divides and becomes 4 branches. The name of the first one is Pishon. It is the one that flows around the whole land of Havilah, where there is gold, and the gold of that land is good. And it talks about the other stones there. The name of the second river is Gihon. It is the one that flows around the whole land of Cush. And the name of the third river is Tigris, which flows east of Asia, and the fourth river is Euphrates. Now, it's important to know that descendants of Ham are Cush, Egypt, Put, Canaan. All these are descendants of the so-called cursed Ham. And of course, the descendants of Cush are Seba, Havilah, and all these others there, if you may look at those. Now, let's look at these 4 rivers a little more closely, as far as if we're going to talk, if it's really geographical, you know, geography we're talking about. These 4 rivers are associated with the territory inhabited by the offsprings of Cush. Actually, in the ancient world, was the region of Ethiopia, and we're going to look at Ethiopia a little later. What region of that world was called Ethiopia? So the river Gihon flows around the whole land of Cush. Pishon flows around the whole land of Havilah. Tigris, Euphrates, these colors refer to as a region of Mesopotamia. This entire region, we're talking about an area that has been in the ancient world would be described as Ethiopia. All right. So we want to make the point that the question of Noah's descendant in the biblical narrative is not about race, but geography. So we just look at Ethiopia there, we're going to come and look at it. Now, the modern separation of Africa from the so-called Middle East is alien to ancient geography, the ancient geography of the region. This term Middle East is an artificial imposition upon world geography subsequent to the construction of the Suez Canal. So here we have Egypt, and here's the Suez Canal there, but that was a sort of artificial imposition. The research in the African Study Bible indicates that the entire region is associated with the territory of Ham. As some scholars refer to the people of the region as Afro-Asiatic. Afro-Asiatic. We're all Black and colored people. Now let us look at Ethiopia a little more closely. Ethiopia, it actually comes from the Greek word Aethiops, which actually means burnt skinned. Cush is also what we call Ethiopia. The region of Cush is also what is called Ethiopia in the ancient world. So for example, Moses' Cushite wife is an Ethiopian. So Ethiopia includes a far more extensive region in the ancient world. In fact, it extended from South Egypt, sub-Saharan Africa in general. And so the current demarcations are largely fruits of modern colonialism. All these demarcations, all these things we see marked off here, these are rather modern impositions on the text. But when we talk about Ethiopia, often the Bible is referring these, Egypt, all these areas referred to as Ethiopia. However, there's a, if I may use my, let's see my highlighter pen. Here's my pen. Yeah, so some people mark off this region here, somewhere here as a region of Cush. I think I have another map there. So ancient Ethiopia, if I may say a little more on that, ancient Greek historians such as Herodotus, sorry, that's what he said, Herodotus, use the word Ethiopia to refer to people who live immediately to the south of Egypt. There's a spelling error there. The kingdom of Cush, part of Egypt, Nubia, Sudan, and also in general to refer to all of sub-Saharan Africa. So when we're talking about Ethiopia in the ancient world, don't think of this little region here. This is a modern rendering of Ethiopia. Ethiopia includes regions, from south of Egypt all the way down to sub-Saharan Africa in the ancient world. So when we talk about Ethiopia in the ancient world, we're talking about Africa for a great part in general. So we go back to say again, the question of Noah's descendants in the biblical narrative is not about race, but about geography. Noah's descendants, they were all from the same genetic stock. The descendants of Shem were people of color. They settled alongside their Hamitic cousins in the Arabian Peninsula, and this includes Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Iraq, Jordan, those areas. Now, migration and conquest led to intense genetic mingling of these tribes. The approximately 2 million souls that escaped Egyptian bondage under Moses included a mixed multitude. They were all mixed up people, as you see, Moses himself. This intermingling continued with Greek and Roman invasion, so that today the term Semite is not really as simple as it may appear. Semites were not originally Caucasians. A large percentage of the populace of Egypt and Ethiopia appear to be mixed race. Why do they appear to be mixed race? They appear to be mixed race because of if something is happening here in my text. Appear to be mixed race again because of the invasion of European conquest, Greeks and the Romans and so forth. So we see a lot of intermarrying and so forth there. So in the ancient world, there was so much mix of race. So that when you're talking about race today, it is really something that was not, this as it is today. It was not that way in the ancient world. You didn't have that kind of, race, what did I say? Racial or color interpretation of people's relationships and so on and so forth. All right. So when we talk about the territory of Ham, perhaps we're still talking about Ethiopia. And so if you want to look, if you want to look literally at the biblical narrative, the history and the geography, then this territory of the so-called cursed Ham is actually the land of origin. It's also the land of promise. It's Ethiopia. It's the first geographical area mentioned in the Bible. And it appears to be the location of Eden. And the word Eden means paradise. The promised land Canaan is also territory of Ham, as if you want to go literally with the Bible. All right. And this includes Lebanon, Israel, Palestine, parts of Syria, and Jordan. Now, it's important to note here that recent scientific evidence locates the remains of the most ancient human ancestors in Africa. Does this relate to the geographical ground from which God formed humanity? It's just asking a question. And in Genesis, I just want to say very quickly here, in Genesis, God created Adam, or God created Adam from Ha-Adamah. Ha-Adamah means the earth, the ground itself, the earth. And the term Adam actually means humanity. It doesn't mean man as in male of the species. It is later in Genesis that we see Ish and Isha meaning male and female, but Adam in Genesis 1 is actually humanity, and Adamah is the earth from which Adam came or was created. So I'm just using that to asking to say, if we're looking literally then at Genesis, is this Adamah, is this ground, is it located in Africa based on the scientific evidence that locates the most ancient human ancestors in Africa? And of course, you can all take me up on that, but that's okay. Just something to think about and to discuss. Now, let's look a little, again, even further closely at some Ethiopian relationships. Now, here is the question of the Cushite woman that Moses married. So in Numbers 12:1, the story is that while they were at Hazeroth, Miriam and Aaron spoke against Moses because of the Cushite woman whom he had married. For he had indeed married a Cushite woman. Now, what I'm saying here, many have interpreted this from a very racialized context, from a modern racialized culture, but it may be a mistake to look at this through this modern racialized culture, that he married a Black woman and they were mad with him. Now, this obviously is another wife. Moses had been married to Zipporah, who was a Semite, for over 40 years. His new wife is Ethiopian. And I'm arguing here that the focus is not her skin color, but her nationality. I may be wrong, but that's my argument. Now, Isaiah described the Ethiopians as a people tall and smooth, feared near and far, mighty and conquering. The Ethiopians had a great reputation back in the ancient world. In fact, a Jewish tradition suggests that this wife that Moses took was an Ethiopian princess. So the question is, was the problem with Moses' wife a power issue rather than a race issue? Because they did ask the question, they didn't ask the question, why did Moses marry a woman of a different race? They were asking, did God not also speak through us? That was the problem they were having. In other words, they were questioning Moses' authority. So there seemed to have been a power issue rather than a race issue. As far as the wife and the pedigree of the wife that Moses took. And that's my theory on that. I think it is a mistake, I repeat, to read this idea of Moses marrying a Cushite woman, an Ethiopian, a Black woman, through the lens of modern racialized culture. I think the idea of her being a Cushite is that she was from a powerful nation, and perhaps that was the problem. We look at another relationship, Ethiopian. We know the Queen of Sheba, an Ethiopian monarch, powerful. And again, she ruled over a territory encompassing both Ethiopia and Egypt. And let me say this, friends. Ethiopia, oftentimes in the ancient world, Ethiopia and Egypt tend to use these two words, tend to refer to Egypt also as Ethiopia, because ancient Ethiopia, the part of what is now perhaps another southern part of Egypt, was included in the region called Ethiopia. To say that Queen Sheba was this monarch, she was monarch of quite a huge region. We're not talking about a little country that is now demarcated that we call Ethiopia. And so Queen Sheba elevates Solomon and makes commendatory judgment about his wisdom and his justice. From the standpoint of economics, her kingdom outranked Israel, and her laudatory words would have carried immense weight as it heightened the prestige of Solomon and his fledgling new kingdom among the nations. So what we are looking at is the queen of a superior kingdom, you know, who comes to sort of give Solomon some reputation among the nations. There we see again the power of Africa there. Another Ethiopian relationship is the eunuch, as we find that in Acts, and the eunuch and Queen Candace. And we can read from Acts there where the Ethiopian eunuch comes into Jerusalem to worship. He's servant of another powerful Ethiopian queen. Now, what is significant about this Ethiopian eunuch, friends, is that he was not a Gentile. He was not a Gentile. He's reading from Isaiah. So what we need to understand is that there were many persons who subscribed to the Abrahamic religion in Ethiopia. Because of the intermixing and the intermingling of religion and culture, there was a large section of, or a large population of Abrahamic people in Ethiopia, or would you say Abrahamic religion? They were all Abrahamic anyway, religion, if you may say that, if we may say that. Oh, no, I didn't say that wrong. Abrahamic religion. And actually, Ethiopic is a Semitic language, by the way. So his Abrahamic religion has nothing to do with his race. He's African. And what we see is that Ethiopian eunuch becomes an instrument in spreading the gospel of Jesus the Christ to the dispersed people of God. Who were the dispersed people of God? The diaspora Jews in Ethiopia, all right, if we may call Jews. Again, we talk about Semite and Jews. We have to think beyond race when we're thinking about the ancient world. And so we have seen that rivers flow out of Ethiopia to water the Garden of Eden. And what we see, we can ask the question, how does the story in Acts reinforce the rootedness of Judeo-Christianity in Africa? So what this story does, it is likely that it reinforces the rootedness of Judeo-Christianity in Africa. Then we now look at the African foundation of the early church. And if I may read here from the book of Acts. In the church at Antioch, there were prophets and teachers: Barnabas, Simeon, who was called Niger, Lucius of Cyrene, Manaen, a childhood friend of Herod the ruler, and Saul. While they were worshiping the Lord and fasting, the Holy Spirit said, "Set apart for me Barnabas and Saul for the work to which I have called them." Then after fasting, they prayed, laid hands on them, and sent them off. So here we see these prophets and teachers include Barnabas, Simon, called Niger, Lucius of Cyrene, Manaen, and Saul. The two people of interest here are Simon, and Simon is a Hebrew name. Niger is his nickname. It's a Latin word for black, which assumes that he was black. Lucius of Cyrene is located in Northern Africa. So what we see here again, when we're talking about, the Hebrew faith and Judeo-Christianity, we are talking about a region which includes a large portion of Africa. So the Hebraic faith journey was not a Middle Eastern phenomenon as we're now understanding Middle East to be, all right? It is an African phenomenon which includes the region we now call the Middle East. So let's look at three great Bible figures of African descent. Moses. In fact, the name Moses is an African name. It's an African name, so the Hebrew name, it's not a Greek name, it's African. Let's read a little passage from Hebrews 11:24. By faith, Moses, when he became of age, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin. And here is another passage. I had seen their tears and sighs, and I had heard their groans, and would have given every drop of blood in my veins to free them. Do you see how closely these two are related? This is about Moses, but this is a saying from a woman they called Moses, Harriet Tubman. This is a saying about Moses, and this is a quotation from Harriet Tubman. How closely do these two look? They call her Moses. But it seems that she had more in common with Moses, than meets the eye. She was born into slavery, and because of the cruelty of her various masters, she decided at an early age that she would escape slavery and assist others to escape as well. As the Underground Railroad conductor, rescuing her relatives and 70 other slaves until the outbreak of the Civil War, she did not fail a single rescue operation. Like Moses of old, Harriet Tubman could have enjoyed the pleasures of freedom in isolation, but she, like Moses, did not want to rest till her people were free. They have that in common. But what else do they have in common? Moses was an African. He was born in Egypt. Though he was of the Semite tribe of Levi, his ancestors had been intermarrying with Africans for 350 years. He passed as a prince of Egypt. How is it he could pass as a prince of Egypt? It means that the Egyptians and many of the Semites were not separated in terms of race. So what he has in common with Harriet is that Harriet's ancestors are African. Moses himself was an African. As I said, he was born in Africa. He was born in Egypt. And he passed as an Egyptian prince. We can discuss how he managed to pass as an Egyptian prince. Question. All right, next person, let's look at Jesus, mixed heritage of Jesus. Now Jesus, and I want to start with Luke, because Luke has a very profound version of the genealogy of Jesus. And Luke begins by saying Jesus, being, as was supposed, the son of Joseph. That's his disclaimer, as was supposed. Of course, if he had traced Jesus through Mary, you wouldn't need the disclaimer. However, because we know he's Mary's son. Anyway, he says, now Jesus being the son of Joseph, the son of Heli, the son of Mattathiah, etc., etc. And he goes on towards the end, where he ends with, he's the son of Adam, the son of God. So what Luke does is that he takes Jesus all the way back to Adam, notwithstanding that quite a large swath of Adam's sons are left out there. But what Luke is doing here, as he does in the sequel Acts, he's following a trajectory of human oneness, a trajectory of justice and inclusiveness. His genealogy is a powerful summary of the gospel's inclusiveness. The gospel's promise of deliverance is not just restricted to the Jewish descendants of Israel, who at the time were a captured underdog in ancient Greco-Roman Empire, but it extended in equal potency to the entire world, with special regard to the poor, the marginalized, the incarcerated, and the oppressed. So here, Luke attempts to show that Jesus the deliverer comes through this line from Adam back to God. He's son of God because he's son of Adam. That's why he's son of God. Now, if we compare Luke's genealogy with that of Matthew's, we'll see where Luke's genealogy is exclusively a male ancestry, whereas Matthew includes women. We see where Luke's genealogy is anthropocentric, meaning he's tracing Jesus through the human line back to God. And Matthew's genealogy is ethnocentric. He begins with Abraham, son of David, the genealogy of Jesus, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Luke's genealogy naturally includes a mix of regions, but what Matthew does, he specifically points to women of African descent. There's Rahab and Tamar, who are Canaanites. There's Bathsheba, Hittite, descendant of Ham. So we see there in Jesus's genealogy that mix. In both these genealogies, we see a profound attempt to show that Jesus comes through a line that is not necessarily or specifically belonging to any particular race of people, so to speak. So this is a historical research depiction of Jesus. And this looks so different from what we are used to seeing. We tend to see a Jesus who is more Caucasian, and they're all different levels of that. But this is the most historically researched depiction of Jesus to date. There. Again, we can discuss that and talk about that later. Another figure that we know very well is Melchizedek. He's in Hebrews 7:1-4, and a lot is said of Melchizedek. I like to read about Melchizedek. Melchizedek in the book of Hebrews is king of Salem. He's priest of the Most High God. He met Abraham as he was returning from defeating the kings and blessed him. And to him, Abraham apportioned 1/10 of everything. His name in the first place means king of righteousness. Melchizedek. Next, he's also king of Salem. That is king of peace. That's the author of Hebrew describing him from the Old Testament. Without father, without mother, without genealogy, well, this is where we get the Hebraic tradition. Having neither beginning of days nor end of life, but resembling the Son of God, he remains a priest forever. Now, if perfection, as it goes on to say, now, if perfection had been attained through the Levitical priesthood, for the people received the law under his priesthood, what further need would there have been to speak of another priest arising according to the order of Melchizedek, rather than one according to the order of Aaron? For when there is a change in the priesthood, there is necessarily a change in the law as well. Now, the one of whom these things are spoken belonged to another tribe, from which no one has ever served at the altar. For it is evident that our Lord was descended from Judah, and in connection with that tribe, Moses said nothing about priests. It is even more obvious when another priest arises resembling Melchizedek, one who has become a priest not through a legal requirement concerning physical descent, but through the power of an indestructible life. For it is attested to him, you are a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. And in Genesis 7:1-4, it says, King Melchizedek of Salem brought out bread and wine. He was priest of God Most High. He blessed him and said, Blessed be Abraham by God Most High, maker of heaven and earth. Blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand. And Abraham gave him 1/10 of everything. Now, I enjoy reading the Hebrew version of the Melchizedek story, because what the Hebrew version of the Melchizedek, the book of Hebrews version of the Melchizedek, Hebrews, I should say Hebrews, version of the Melchizedek story is trying to do is to deconstruct the whole concept of physical descent. Here, even though he's trying to show that we have moved beyond priesthood, but I see there a Melchizedek, the story of Melchizedek being used to deconstruct the whole concept of physical descent. Whereas we tend to, in this culture, become so caught up on, who is who, what is your pedigree, all those things. Here, it's actually saying Melchizedek actually had no pedigree. And he is that priest after whom Jesus or he's the, what's the word I'm looking for? He's the type of the of Jesus's priesthood. It has no pedigree and it needs no pedigree. Now, who is Melchizedek? Now, there are several Black historians who will say that Melchizedek was an African. Of course, we're talking about Africa. Based on what I've said so far, it is quite a likelihood that he was indeed African. Melchizedek is an original inhabitant of Jebus, or Jebus, as you may say, the original name of Jerusalem. The Jebusites were Canaanites, descendants of Ham. Jackson argues that as king of Jerusalem before it was Jerusalem, he was a Canaanite, a Jebusite, and a Black man. Black people in the Bible. That's his take on it. But the most important point here is that he's a descendant of the so-called cursed Canaan. And yet this Melchizedek becomes, his priesthood is the very order of the priesthood of Jesus Messiah. And I think we should meditate carefully on the Hebrews account of this Melchizedek priesthood. Because here he's highlighting a priesthood that does not need pedigree. It does not need any kind of physical descent. It does not need any of those things that in our common human culture we impose upon people's function, upon who they are, that we use to define them. And here it is that this Melchizedek, if we may say, becomes the very archetype of the kind of priesthood that the early church was pursuing. One does not need law, does not need pedigree, does not need physical descent. And I think that is something perhaps we can meditate on. So if I may summarize here, Bible history is Black history. The biblical narrative emerges from a non-racialized Afro-Asiatic context. Africa is the seat of the Genesis creation story. The so-called curse of Ham is a racist imposition upon the text and has distorted the rich Africanism of the Bible. The Caucasian depiction of major Bible figures, including Moses and Jesus, needs closer examination. The accounts indicate that these were a minimum of mixed race with strong African heritage. Africans were at the forefront of the spread of the gospel. Now, I want to tell a story here of every time I think of, the Africanism of scripture, if I may think of it, it reminds me of a professor I had when I was Fuller Theological Seminary. His name was Cecil Roebuck. He was a Pentecostal, and he was a Pentecostal ambassador to the Vatican. And I did a course, Modern Church History, with him. And there was one thing I remember very clearly in the class. Often in class, when we got to the whole idea of the rise of Pentecostalism, and Pentecostalism began as a Black movement. It was Black believers that started the Pentecostal church, and it began as an interracial church. at a time when America was still segregated. Unfortunately, it split later between black and white, you know, the white church, white part of Pentecostalism becoming the Assemblies of God and the black section becoming the Church of God in Christ. But Cecil Roebuck was this profound church historian, especially modern church history. And Cecil Roebuck was a white man. And when I say he was white, he was like about in his early 40s. He was white, very white. His hair was platinum blonde. But this man would get up when he's talking about Pentecostalism and he'd dance and he'd clap and he says, I'm so proud of my African heritage, you know, because he's saying how Pentecostalism started as this black church movement and they brought into it. In fact, many church historians would say that Pentecostalism resembled the early church, a primitive Christianity, which was still, what did I say, still ensconced in its Africanism. So today, the kind of, the ways in which we turn up our noses at African themed music, especially music with percussions and so forth, is really, again, a modern colonial imposition upon an ancient religiosity that was rooted in African culture. And we saw in Pentecostalism that came back and the Pentecostal believers brought that, and even white Pentecostalism today are so proud of that African heritage, that dancing, that singing, that, you know, all that, what do they say, speaking in tongues and so forth. And so, you know, I find it very interesting that today we have come so far from a history of, you know, in the Bible, rooted in African culture, rooted in the experience of Black and colored people, rooted in their specific spirituality. And somehow, at some point in our history, we've come to turn up our noses at that and to see anything African as less than ideal. And so, you know, I end my slide with this question: can I have my African rhythm back, please? I think that was too long.
Wow. Thank you so much, Dr. Hemmings. You have given us so much to think about. You have raised quite a bit of questions in my head. Now is the time for you guys to raise your hands for your questions and your comments. Feel free to do that now. I will acknowledge you and also request that you unmute at that point so that you can ask Dr. Hemmings your questions or share your comments with the rest of us. So, Lauren, you will be the first to join our conversation this afternoon. You can go ahead and unmute.
Oh, thank you so much. I really appreciate that, all of that. That was a beautiful presentation. I guess what one is left with after listening to that is how and where was the concept of the Africanism of Scripture. I mean, it just makes a lot of sense what you said. It was, after all, a Middle Eastern religion on the shores of the Mediterranean. It makes perfect sense to think that people were not only African people, but there were pretty much everybody would have had dark skin at that time, darker than mine at least. And so where did, in the history of biblicism and people taking the Bible so very seriously, isn't it interesting where all this got completely lost? And exactly the inverse of what the Bible describes became a religious belief, such that you had to segregate people from one another and persecute them and make them by law regarded as inferior. How did that happen? Where did it happen early on, or is this a product of the Enlightenment and later?
I think it's earlier, because I think those depictions, those first depictions of Jesus as white, I think some of them were from the Byzantine era. So, you know, I think once what was the early church started becoming a religion called Christianity that was taken over by the Roman Empire, and it began to shift and take on that European flavor and start being interpreted through European lenses.
So that's
so it began there.
astonishing.
The slide
That started
became-
happening
yes.
early on.
Pardon me?
That's astonishing how early that began to happen.
Yes, and even though, however, in the early church, Augustine and Tertullian, these were not Africans. They were African, in fact, darker skinned African. So, you know, even in the early church, you had some of the great church fathers, so to speak. They were African. So Africa was still very much part of that. But there became a downward slope, you know, began, you know, with Byzantine Christianity moving, making Jesus white. And then, you know, as you move into, as the, what did we say now, as the gospel spread further into, you know, Romanism and Europeanism and colonialism, all of that, you know, then it becomes more and more interpreted from this standpoint. And of course, with the transatlantic slave trade, here comes the curse of Ham becoming, you know, this very, what's the word I'm looking for? Convenient way of justifying that.
So the curse of Ham doesn't show up until the slave trade begins.
Well, I think there is a Talmudic reference to it. So it doesn't really originate with Christianity of such, a reference to it. But I think that idea became a full-blown racist idea with that colonialist project.
That's fascinating. Thank you.
Thank you, Lauren, for your contribution. Linda, go ahead and unmute.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Hemmings. I apologize, I missed the first few minutes of your presentation, but I appreciated it very much and your insights. I just have one brief question. If I understood one of your slides properly, it appeared that you suggested that the children of Israel had been intermarrying with the Egyptians. I think you put 350 years on your slide. And I'm a little curious about that, because somehow I was of the understanding that because the children of Israel were sheep herders, they were anathema to the Egyptians. In fact, Genesis 43 talks about that when Joseph's brothers came back bringing Benjamin, that they would not eat, the Egyptians would not eat with Joseph's brothers because they despised them, scripture says. And I thought that was really God's plan of warehousing the genealogy of Abraham's descendants by having them be in a place where the likelihood of intermarriage was slim to non-existent.
Well, Joseph himself married to Egyptians. He married Egyptians, I'm not sure how what you're saying is at all possible. Yes, you may have some kind of what do I say, a prejudice as far as their social class or whatever is concerned, but the reality is that there was intermarriage. As we see in the Bible itself, Joseph's wives were Egyptian wives. So, yeah.
Is there any particular scriptural reference other than Moses' particular choice of a wife that would suggest that there was a great deal of intermarriage?
Well, as we say, the people who came from Egypt with Moses was a mixed multitude. How do you figure coming out from Egypt as a mixed multitude? How do you figure a segregation there? which suggests, and the fact is too that that Moses himself, how can Moses hide as a Jewish person? What makes him pass as an Egyptian prince? Was it his race? Was it his, what is it that made him pass as an Egyptian prince? You know. So what the historians are saying is that intermarriage was taking place. It is a natural situation. Regardless of what we may assume to be God's ideal. And I don't think, you know, the question of intermarriage was not so much as a question of race. It was a question of cultural purity, if you may call that. But that was never achieved in the ancient world, so-called cultural purity.
Well, I'm still a little puzzled by that because, you know, when Ezra and Nehemiah brought folks back to begin to repair the temple in the city of Jerusalem, ultimately those Levites that were permitted to begin to participate in temple services were only the ones that had brought papers with them and could prove their lineage. I've just had the sense that lineage seemed to be so very important, which is why intermarriage was highly discouraged. And I wasn't speaking about race particularly. I just had always had the understanding that the children of Israel were, you know, while they may have had their own failings in choosing wives outside to marry, that God had more of a protective shield around them because of his intentions for the Messiah.
Yeah.
So
you're right as far as the intent to preserve that lineage, but the reality is that yes, you could still trace a lineage. The fact that you intermarry doesn't mean that you have lost that lineage at all. If
Well,
you understand
okay.
what I'm trying to say.
Thank
But
you.
you're right, that was the ideal to preserve the lineage. And I'm sure there are people here who are more, perhaps have more, you know, if you have more insight into that, you know, you can chip in, let us know.
Olive, wasn't there something about the mixed multitude has now this, I don't know if this is scripture or just traditional, that the mixed multitude was considered sort of the integrated hangers on to the children of Israel, something like that. I'm trying to remember.
Yeah, whatever you want to call it, hangers on. But the way many of the Bible historians look at that mixed multitude as just that, a mixed multitude, people were Egyptians as well. There were Egyptians there who came in, who did not identify as of that, you know, Semite stock at all.
Interesting.
So,
Thank you.
yeah.
Thank you, Linda, for your contribution. iPhone, I'm going to ask you to unmute and identify yourself and join our conversation.
And there's a very important, very interesting, and very a point here in the chat that Judaism was very strong on proselytism. So, you know, that will help in answering the question earlier by Linda. That the fact that they intermarried, it didn't mean that they lost, you know, because the point is that they preserve that faith. That was what was going on. So lineage might not even be the biggest thing there, but the faith, which was what the Bible was sort of leaning towards, that faith and that one God, Yahweh.
Okay, thank you. iPhone?
Hi, good morning. I think I'm iPhone. I'm not sure, but I was unmuted. So I think since I can't unmute myself, I think I'm iPhone. And so,
Yes.
okay, so happy Sabbath.
Happy Sabbath.
Just in passing, hearing the previous conversation, this was not my point, but just in passing, maybe a comment about the, for lack of a better word, the cultural mixture of the tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh would be appreciated. I'd appreciate hearing the speakers speak about that. But my real question had to do with, is there possibility of getting a referral to the PowerPoint presentation? How can we get that? And is it possible to be able to view today's presentation at a later date? And if so, how do we get that? And is there a bibliography for the information that was shared today? And if so, how do we get that?
I can answer the question about the recording. We're recording it. We already recorded Olive's presentation, and so you'll have all of her slides and her presentation on our YouTube channel. And all you have to do is go to YouTube and look up Adventist Today YouTube channel, and you'll get it. In fact, all of our recordings are there, going back for over a year. As for whether Olive wants to share her slides or not, that's up to her. But you can see this. You can certainly see the slides in the presentation on our YouTube channel. It takes about a week for our video editor to get it done and get it up, but it will be there. By the way, iPhone, who are you?
My name is Daryl White.
Okay, Daryl. Yeah,
Okay.
we'll get that that recording up for you.
Okay, great, appreciate that. And once again, I was curious about the bibliography, and also curious about whether or not the speaker would like to comment about the cultural mixture of the two tribes, Manasseh and Ephraim, if she has any thoughts about that.
And I have none. Do you have any about that? Like I said, this is research I did. This is my own discovery as I was asked to do work on this in the summer.
Oh, okay.
So, yes.
Well, my understanding is that, as you indicated earlier, that Joseph did marry an Egyptian, and the offspring from that union included Manasseh and Ephraim.
Okay.
So, my understanding is that those two tribes would have Egyptian ancestry in them.
Okay. Oh, I see. That's what you're talking about. Sorry. All right. Thank you for clarifying that. I misread your question. Very
Right.
good. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much for your contribution. So we're going to move on now to Tanisha. Go ahead and unmute and join our conversation. Tanisha?
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Hemmings. Always a pleasure to hear you. And I had so many thoughts and feelings listening to the presentation. So my question though is, for those of us that, well, for me, leaving this conversation, and at some point, I know it's going to come up where I will want to share some of the information that you've shared today that was refreshing for me. I'll probably get asked, well, why is this even important? Can you share why, given how far removed we are from the incidents in the Bible, why is this important as opposed to just focusing on doctrine and theology?
Well, it's important. The first reason is many Black people have rejected the Bible. They say it's a white man's product. We don't need that. And I want to say it is not. That is far from it. There's so many Black people have rejected the Bible based on that, lack of knowledge about, the cultural history of the Bible. And second, also is to sort of put to rest this idea and this justification of what would I see, a sort of racial Cold War, which is even in our churches. There's a racial Cold War in Christendom. I call it a Cold War because it's there. It's sometimes overt and covert. And I think it's based on these uninformed approach to scriptures. Those are two main reasons why this is very important. And I'm hoping that understanding of this will bring us to a place where we understand that the way we have racialized the text and our interpretation of the text is itself destructive or toxic to our relationships, interracial relationships and interpersonal relationships.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you for your contribution, Tanisha. Dr. Hemmings, before we move on, so I'm following up on what you just shared. So being that we understand the primary reason why a lot of Black people seem to reject the teachings of the Bible, for us Christians, Black Christians who are now coming into this new understanding, and you being an educator, do you see any avenue with which we can use this information to now start to change mindsets, and probably exploring that from using the younger people, given that a lot of older people are already set in their ways and they've made their decisions? Do you think that there's an avenue someplace that we could explore and then present this information to the younger people and hopefully have this becoming, something of a new way to look at things?
And if you know, thanks for the question, if you notice, I am focused on the non-racialized context,
Right.
historical, cultural context of the Bible. That is my concern.
Right.
That it was not racialized. We have done that, and we have done that. It has been done mainly in the interest of justifying the marginalization of a whole, class of humanity. We need to get away from that. And I think that a lot of young people coming up today, they have this view of the Bible that is not based on information, accurate information. It's based on heresy. It's based on a misappropriation of the Bible and the context and so forth. So this is another way in which we need to read the Bible in context. Another way in which we need to read it in context, because it's not only in this way where we misconstrue what's happening in the Bible. In many other ways, we just misuse the Bible. That's the main reason why people reject the Bible: the misuse, misinterpretation, and misapplication of it. So this is another way of trying to bring it to bring some sanity back to really what's happening in the Bible, reading it in context, and so on.
Thank you for that. Sherry-Ann, you are next to join our conversation. Go ahead and unmute.
All right, thanks, Tamika. Thank you so much, Dr. Hemmings. Really appreciated your presentation this afternoon. And I'm reminded of a book that I read several years ago called In Search of Black History, that was sharing that the history of the Black race did not begin with 400 years of slavery, which is one of the challenges that a lot of persons have, where they, if that is the starting point, then that same marginalization and stuff becomes something that you have to rethink. And one of the things that fascinated me in Jamaica is where the concept of anything that no good, and for those non-Jamaicans, that anything that is Black is not good, it's so entrenched that when the Bible was translated into Jamaican or into Patois, there are persons who thought that what you were doing then was irreverent, and it should not be presented in that way because it's a holy book. But yet that is the language that most Jamaicans speak natively. And with this superiority of the Europeans being presented as something that's coming into the church from so early on, but yet they were the minority. So how did we get to the point where they were able to present all of these racial constructs into a situation where that was not the issue? How did we get to that point, from the socio-political challenges to it becoming one of race that has so proliferated, or society that it's seen as acceptable and as truth, for even persons of the Black race who now put glass ceilings over themselves because they start to accept some of these limiting beliefs.
Okay. Oh, what do you mean by they were the minority? Who were the minority?
In terms of the Europeans, in terms of
Well-
just numbers.
Well, as
Mhm.
far as, well, not much is said about Europeans did not enter into the biblical narrative in a significant sense until we get to New Testament, the spread of the gospel and so forth. That's where it came in. But what became Christianity actually became now a European thing. It was taken over when Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire. It became a Roman religion, and it spread, to Europe. It became an instrument of Roman imperialism and later European colonialism. It was used as justification for a colonialist enterprise and subjugation of people of various nations. It became justification for apartheid in South Africa. It became the justification for the transatlantic slave trade and so on. That this was a misappropriation of the gospel, hijack, I would say, of the gospel, which a lot of people do not recognize. We are now the beneficiaries, if you may call it, of that hijacked gospel. I think the real church of the primitive church is crying somewhere in the wilderness. It is in the wilderness. It has been in the wilderness for a long, long time. And so what we have to realize, and that was a church of mixed people. The early church was mixed with people. That sort of thing was not there until it became the state religion of Rome. That was where it became South. It was no longer a reflection of the religion of Jesus of Nazareth, the early apostles, and all those who were preaching a gospel of liberation, of the Spirit of the Lord, who anoints to preach good news to the poor and the oppressed. It moved away from that, and so I just believe that early primitive church is lost, and from time to time we hear it crying from the wilderness, but it is lost. I think I sort of strayed from your original question. What's your original question again?
No, that's fine. I think you came around to answer it in terms of, how did we get to the point where it became about race rather than the socio-political issues that it was before.
Yeah. And so when we say when Christianity became the the religion of the Roman Empire, again, I want to refer another church history course I did at Fuller Theological Seminary. I think it was called, that was early church history. And again, the professor was a Presbyterian minister. And every morning, when he began the class, he would say, friends, if you don't remember anything in this class, remember this. What we call Christianity is really a baptism of Roman paganism. And that's
Okay.
where it began, that downward slide, where it became an instrument of empire. Once a religion becomes an instrument of empire, then we see all this distortion creeps in, and that's what we have inherited.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you for your contribution, Sherry-Ann. Ed, please unmute and join our conversation.
Good afternoon. I'm not a scientist, but about 15 years ago, I had the occasion to work for a client on creating strategies of how to use genetic medicine for the future, which got me interested in genetics. And if I understand it, the current theory, and they took the name from a movie, Out of Africa. Current genetic theory says that Homo sapiens flowed out of Africa to the rest of the world originally. Now, you may believe that or not believe it, or it may be proven not to be true, but right now that's the state of play in the field of genetics, is that humans came out of Africa. Now, I don't know what that does to the creation story and the idea of the Garden of Eden up there in the Middle East. But if that's true, then the idea of Melchizedek somewhere in the Levant being a black man is entirely probable. And I'm wondering, Dr. Hemmings, if anybody you are aware of is doing any work at the intersection of belief and genetics, and how things may have flowed around the world in ancient times. As a matter of fact, it might be surprising if people in the Middle East, because that's the first place that the humans flowed to out of Africa, it'd be surprising if they were not black or something very close to black. As a matter of fact, I have a friend sent me a message a minute ago, says, well, where'd the white people come from anyway? So I don't know if you have any thoughts about that, Dr. Hemmings, but I just thought I'd throw that out.
Thank you, Ed. And Ed always has some difficult questions. And I find it interesting. To me, I find it a proposal to see who is doing any studies in at the intersection of genetics and what we see there in scripture. But I did mention in this presentation that based on these rivers that are described that water the Garden of Eden, if we look at it in ancient geography, they're actually flowing out of Ethiopia. And when we talk about Ethiopia, what we see as modern Ethiopia today is not Ethiopia in the ancient world. It included from the very southern part of Egypt down to sub-Saharan Africa. That's what was referred to as Ethiopia in the ancient world. So the whole idea of Middle East is a very modern thing. So scholars prefer to refer to that area as the Afro-Asiatic region. Rather than Middle East. Middle East is a sort of imposition, I think, with the building of the Suez Canal. The Suez Canal was built in, was it 1860 or 1890s, I think. I'm trying to remember the date there. But that was when you had that separation. But that entire region was a single region of mixed Afro-Asiatic peoples. So if you want to look at the gods, my proposition and that of many scholars that I've looked at, is that if we're looking at it literal, this Garden of Eden is actually in Africa. And I did raise the question as to whether that relates to the fact that indeed, as you said there, geneticists are tracing human ancestry back to Africa, that the original humanity came out of Africa. And that is the most modern genetic research there. And I don't know what it does to Genesis account. And they go back to say it comes from a black woman, not a black man. So that we all came from a black woman.
There you go.
Well, that challenges his account, but like I say, I need to look at see. That's a good idea. I really want to see what's happening in this genetic research. I'd love to explore that a little further there. Yes.
It might be possible that we white people are just in a genetic mutation.
I wouldn't say that. It's just that what we need to say is just that the biblical narrative is located in a region that did not include, Europe and the region where white people live. All right. Later, however, as we see the spread of the gospel, we see it now moving into Europe, Rome, Spain. And in fact, thanks to Alexander the Great, and thanks to, Roman conquest, when the Greeks came in, the Romans came in, we see that melting in now, that coming in, because remember that the capital, Alexander's capital was in Egypt, Alexandria, Egypt. So we see that mix began from way back in the 4th century BCE with Alexandrian conquest. You know.
Yes, there's a little book called The Lost History of Christianity, which very strongly makes the case that for 1,000 years, the center of the Christian church was in Africa and the Middle East.
Yes.
And that Europe was a late development in the development of Christianity.
Yes. Yes, definitely.
Thank you.
Ed.
Thank you for your contribution, Ed. Bob, please unmute and join our conversation.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Hemmings. It's always such a pleasure to hear you. Now, I think I get the picture based on your presentation and just normal history where there's the Afrocentric genesis and rise of biblical events, and over time, as populations disperse and mix, then and it becomes more Eurocentric, and then we have a narrative that is inconsistent with the original historical basis of religion. I understand that. Now, and I'll preface my question by saying this. In war, they say that the spoils belong to the victor. In that basis, would you support the proposition that says that during the time when Afrocentrism was the center of history and religion, et cetera, we did not have modern means of mass communication or the rise of technology in mass producing text and information. And it so happens that at the time when the Europeans controlled the world, then they had the means and opportunity of these instruments of mass communication and information, and also political power. So that was what they used to effectively reverse the Afrocentric nature of the Bible to make it European. Would you subscribe to the theory that because of that power and opportunity, that's what they used to turn the tables and present a white Bible, a white Jesus, a white God, etc. That's one. And secondly, you did mention that one reason why many Blacks turn away from the Bible is based on misinformation and misunderstanding. I think Dr. Hemmings, I'll take a little exception to that, in the sense that I think they turn away from the Bible not because of their own misunderstanding or misinformation, but from the manipulation of the Bible by Europeans and whites to their detriment. And they look at it and they are saying, no, I could not accept this. So they are resisting the product of the misinformation and the manipulation of the Bible. That's why they're rejecting, not out of their own misunderstanding. So I think that's sort of how I am inclined. That's how I'm inclined to look at it. So I wanted to know what do you think of? Do you think that's the reason why we now have a European model of Adventism? And my second question is this. Well, let me just explain it. You're in academia, and I want to bring it more to Adventism and our academic, particularly our tertiary institutions. This twisting of the Bible, this twisting of the Europeanization of the Bible. Would you agree that it is being abetted by even, say, Adventist institutions, in the sense that there's no effort that being made to present it, whether in research or in normal academic events. There's nothing that's being done to sort of correct the legacy of this type of racialized and racist interpretation of the Bible. And let me give you an example. So in my church, along these lines, I've always held and suggested to them that we should sort of transform the church into an anti-racist organization. And by the way, I got that from the city, because one of our tenets in city government under Mayor Adams is that we want to transform city agencies and the city into an anti-racist organization. So based on that, I suggest to the church that we try to develop an anti-racist model. One example of this is that I suggested to them, when we have the children's story, and for the cradle role and the primary, we do not need to show a white Jesus. We do not need to show a white God. And you would not believe, many Blacks say, well, if it's a Black Jesus, I object to it. If it's a Black God, I object to it. So this type of self-hate is a product of this type of control and the Europeanization of religion. So what I want to know, do you think there's any utility in the idea of Adventism? Sort of, I know Adventists are not going to decide to become an anti-racist organization. That's, may not be in their institutional interest. But do you think there's any effort, or there should be an effort to for the church through our academies and our academic institutions to sort of push back against this racialized and racist legacy that we have had in the religion and in Adventism from time, rather than just accepting the status quo? I know it's a little complicated question, but I think you can, you get my, so those are my questions.
Well, yeah, you said a lot, which
Yes.
some more like proclamations rather than questions. But in the last section there, I do not think that the antidote to a white Jesus is a Black Jesus, or a white God is a Black God. It will just turn out to be a race war. And Jesus and God in the middle of a race war. I don't see that as the antidote. I think we need to, first of all, bring people to a spiritual maturity where we stop anthropomorphizing God, because God cannot be placed in any kind of human construct. God is beyond all of that. But as for Jesus, just let's look at the historical Jesus, rather than talk about a Black Jesus or a white Jesus, because the Black Jesus is just as toxic as the white Jesus, because it's about race and race wars. So I would not, at all go with that. But that being said, if we're talking about Adventism and the Europeanization of the Bible, Adventism is not unique to any other Christian denomination. It's a Christian denomination. So, as we could become conscious in our own particular congregations, we have to find ways of making sure that when we talk about God and we talk about Jesus, all are affirmed. That it does not become an instrument of division in any way, but one of understanding, of love and unity. So, and that is why education, proper education about the Bible is very important. What is it saying to us? I wish I had more time to spend on interpreting and applying the Hebrews account of Melchizedek, that he stands beyond genealogy and physical characteristics, that he's beyond all of that. It's a very profound depiction of Melchizedek. because it's telling us what the Christ means
Mhm.
and what it does. It takes us beyond those things.
Mhm.
And I think that's where our Christianity needs to go, beyond all these race wars and the identity struggles. If this Jesus doesn't have blonde hair, blue eyes, I cannot worship him. Or if he's not black with dreadlocks, I can't worship him. We need to go beyond that identity religion to something that transcends that.
Right. Why not make him non-ethnic? Just they have these models of a non-ethnic figure. That's what I'm thinking. Not a black Jew, but make him non-ethnic or multi-ethnic.
Yeah. Maybe we need to stop depicting Jesus and depict the Christ instead. And if you depict the Christ, then the Christ can be anything and can be everything.
Okay.
Because Christ is about, the place where we come into unity with God and with one another.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Hemmings.
Dan, it is your turn to join the conversation. Go ahead and unmute.
Thank you. It was, well, before I ask my question, it was an excellent presentation, by the way. I really enjoyed it, Dr. Hemmings, but jumping back for a second to Ed's postulation that the white race is a mutation. I don't know the answer to that, but I did read, I think it was in a study cited by National Geographic, that redheads are a definite mutation and will probably die out before the end of this century. So.
What did you say is a definite mutation?
A redheaded, that's redhead.
Oh, redhead.
Yeah.
Oh, I love redhead.
Which I was
so
of
much.
one before I turned all
It's
gray.
so beautiful.
Well, the other thing is that apparently red hair dye is the most widely selling hair dye. So for whatever that means. But your presentation was very timely for us because we're doing a separate Bible study currently on the issue of the biblical analysis of whether gays and transgender and the whole gender spectrum is approved or discouraged by the Bible. And of course, our point of view is that, yeah, the Bible does not support discrimination and exclusion of LGBTQ people. But I was curious, bringing back into more current times, that in the academic community, is there a lot of cross analysis, biblical analysis on those extended rainbow people? I recall, some years ago, there was antagonism maybe on some parts of the Black community that the gays were gaining too much notoriety and they were losing their momentum. Blacks were losing the momentum of their equality struggle. What's the academic point of view, and even beyond that, what do you think the current state of the Rainbow Coalition is? It healthy, or is there still a lot of division?
Well, there is division in academia, but academia is moving more and more to recognizing that LGBTQ, these are biological realities. These are not people simply trying to make a cultural or social statement. These are biological realities. I attended two conferences put on by the North American Division. They're called conferences on transgender persons, transgender people, some years ago. One was in California and one was in Florida. I think they were done 2 years apart from each other. And with the one in California was the section where they look at genetics was done by a geneticist from Loma Linda University, showing how we tend to see humanity as XX or XY chromosome, but the chromosomal configurations are far more diverse than that. And showed such diverse configuration of X and Y, XXXY, YYX, all of those they were showing. And in fact, the geneticist in Florida 2 years after was doing the same thing. Of course, but each of them interpreted it differently. Whereas geneticists from Loma Linda said that this is what we're given in nature. And therefore, given that in nature, we need to understand that when we're talking about humanity, we're not just talking about, cisgender, heterosexual human beings. Whereas the geneticist in Florida said, well, even though this is a biological reality, we cannot normalize it. Of course, I took him to task. I said, what do you mean by normalize it? If you say this is a genetic reality, why do you raise the question of normalizing? So it all depends. Academically, there's awareness of that. The question is, on what side of the ideological spectrum are you? How do you interpret that data? And so that's where it's different, whereas, of course, there are the there's the theological academy. There are those who see all human beings, race, gender, gender, sexuality are manifestations of the image of God, whereas those who see that as distortions of the image of God. But I think that more and more the academy is coming towards recognizing that people of all gender and sexuality are representing the image of God. The question is, how do they live out that life? That's the biggest challenge. It's the biggest challenge in religion right now. How do they live out their the reality of their being? And that's where the argument of sex come in, because sometimes all they're thinking of is sex when they think of LGBTQ, whatever. That's all they're thinking of, nothing else. They're not thinking of this is who I am, so to speak.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Hemmings.
Thank you for your contribution, Dan. Clarence, it is now your turn to join our conversation.
Yes, good evening. And thank you, Doctor, for the presentation. Now, like Ed, I have some reservations, should we say, about how we interpret material coming from some writers' suppositions. Some ancient writers' supposition or writer or writers, what they thought were the facts or what they considered to be reality, which in fact science is now showing not to be the case. Are we to, I wouldn't say wrangle, but are we to continue discussing and seeking to make sense out of some writers' imagination or some tradition that people held millennia ago or thousands of years ago? Or should we now lean toward more toward a scientific approach and seek to understand from what real facts are? In short, my question comes back to all this question of origins. The Bible writer says that there were four rivers or four heads of rivers, that's how he put it, coming out of Eden. But when he placed one all the way up north at the head of the Euphrates, and the other one way down south at the head of the Nile. Now, how do you reconcile that? I think they're just trying to make sense or trying to tell us what they thought, but which science and even ordinary geography would dismiss today. What do you think?
Well, as I said, and I showed those as being the Afro-Asiatic region, which today we have separated, and the Suez Canal helped us to do that, to make it seem like different regions. So when you say way up there, you're really looking at an entire region that was really one geographical, cultural region. But I'm glad you asked the question. I'm glad you raised the question about the reality of the story. That's not, I am not, the discussion is not around the reality of the story at all. And I thought somebody would raise that question, and I'm glad you did, so that we can address it. The question we're asking is, if we're going to take it literally, since some take it literally, all right, if we're going to take it literally, the location is in a location that includes people, Black and colored people, okay? So that's what we talk about Ethiopia being the center of that whole ancient culture and geography there. as it
Yeah.
is related, as we see it in the text. Whether it's real or not real is not the question I'm trying to answer here.
Okay.
Yeah,
I hear you. I hear you. Thanks for the clarification. I was
yes,
just going to add that as I mentioned, one head is way up north and the other one way down south. And last night, as I read, somebody even took it further south, saying that that Homo sapiens have been interacting, whereas we once thought that they were simply they came from one particular region. The author was saying, no, it says from genetics and from archaeology, we now see Homo sapiens located in various areas of Africa, all the way down to South Africa and Namibia. Well, that being the case, well, I think we should take a different look at the stories of these origins and consider what shall we hold as factual and on what shall we base our faith.
Yeah.
Thank you.
yes. And as Ed was pointing out there, that the fact that it would appear that Ethiopia, and as we said, Ethiopia is just not Ethiopia, not that little country. Ethiopia was started from South Egypt down into sub-Saharan Africa when the Bible talks about Ethiopia. And we were saying with the geneticists, as the most recent genetic studies tracing humanity to Africa. So what we're trying to say is perhaps there's something to the story, but that's not what we're trying to prove anything. And we're not trying to prove that the story is literal or not literal. We're trying to say what the narrators, the location of the narration, the biblical narration, is in that region of the world, Afro-Asiatic, which includes Africa and what today we call the Middle East.
Okay, it's much more than what we are saying it is today. Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Hi, Lauren. Welcome back to our conversation.
Yeah, this has been fascinating. Clarence asked the question that was knocking around in my mind, and when we talk about this, we talk about it, I think, Olive, in order to say that people's presuppositions about the Bible, that you can't use it to prove racism, and you made a good point to that. I love you saying that. I'm not saying that any of this is real. I'm just saying that it's how people thought about it.
Yeah.
And yeah, that's a really, really important point. Those who believe that all of these things were real proofs one way or the other probably are in trouble, because they're not going to understand what's really going on here. And I should mention that next week, Mari Jackson is going to be taking on, today we're talking about race in the Bible. Next week, Mari Jackson is going to be taking on racism as a social phenomena in the modern world. And so we're going to have a more vigorous discussion of sort of the psychology and sociology of racism. As has been said many times before, race is meaningless at the DNA level. We all interact at the DNA level. It's only meaningful as a social construct. And that's important to say. Olive, one of the things that fascinated me was Cherry Ann's comment. And I would love to bring Cherry Ann back into the conversation again. And Thondazani as well. When she said, there's a feeling like anything that's native to us, anything that's Black, like our own patois language, is somehow inferior. And this is my question. And I asked Thondazani this question as well. I said, to what extent have these theories that are so strong in American fundamentalism been absorbed in those places where almost everybody is Black? Do they have an impact there? And Cherry Ann seemed to indicate that that's the case, that they do have an impact there. Is that true, Cherry Ann?
Hi, Lauren. Yes, that has they do have an impact in the Caribbean, unfortunately. And somebody suggested in the chat that I should be careful to say that not everybody has absorbed this. but it is prevalent enough to be noticeable, that there are persons who accept this. And that's why you have, you know, the straightening of the hair, because or the way our hair grows out of our heads, all kinky and curly, is not, it's seen as not professional. I remember when I was going to get locks, my loctician had a conversation with me in 2006 to say, where do you work? Because this may be a challenge depending on who your employer is, that you're going to show up with locks. So those things are real and have happened, and it's been absorbed into some sections of the society.
Now, do you think it's been absorbed from these biblical theories? Is that what happens? Or I asked Raj Adikan, I said, do the dark-skinned people in India have these beliefs? And he said we certainly have race casteism, where whiteness is valued, but he said that didn't come from the Bible for us. It came from a different source, from a cultural source.
Well, I think for us, the Bible was used as the tool to enforce it. So similar to what Dr. Hemmings would have said, it didn't come from the Bible, but the Bible was used to justify a lot of it.
Yes.
I wonder what Thandazani would say from Africa. Join in this conversation, Thandazani. By the way, you guys need to know Thandazani is one of my favorite writers on Adventist Today and essayists, and he's a student in Near Eastern culture, I think, at the University of Toronto. But he mentioned too, he said, yeah, these texts have been absorbed in our culture as well, and even in the African context. Do you want to join in on that, Thandazani?
Yeah, I think Sherry and spoke eloquently about it. That's exactly what has happened, at least in the southern portion of Africa that I grew up in. The biblical text was used to legitimize a lot of these ideas, and I know to date that if you some people still frown upon like locking your hair is still an issue in the Adventist church. If you suggest on a Sabbath that let's read something more relevant to our situation for Sabbath school, there in a lot of places you might be censured or disfellowshipped. Anything that comes from the GC is coming straight from God, so you can't say anything about it. If a song is not in the hymn book, it's not sanctified. So all of that, it's if it's uniquely Black or African, then it is wrong. But if it has a bit of European or North American, then it's as good as if it came straight from heaven.
Yeah, I don't know if you know one of our other regular participants here, a fellow named Arthur. I think he's going by Arthur Mashake now. He's, I believe, from Zambia. Arthur said that he's had a real wrestling with people in Africa about whether he could wear a traditional African shirt rather than a white shirt and tie. He says, I think my traditional African shirt is a dress shirt. And the elders in the church say, no, your traditional African shirt is inappropriate. The only way to come to church is in a white shirt and necktie. And I find that just fascinating. I mean, that my culture has such power over African culture and Caribbean culture. I mean, that's fascinating to me, Thandazani. You wanted to say some more things though, and I interrupted to ask you a question, but I really find that interesting and kind of sad, really, that Jesus can't be sort of culture blind.
And I think that's what Bob was saying, that the power, the political, socio-political power that Europeans developed at a point in their history was an opportune time to sort of, you know, disseminate that value that devalued, you know, African, anything that is African, or perhaps even not non-European, so to speak.
I think I didn't let Thundazani finish his own question. I kind of called on him there. I apologize, Elder.
Yeah, so I wanted to bring another perspective from the studies of ancient Israelite religion. And just to point out that, first of all, when the what we would later on call the Jews start worshiping Yahweh, Yahweh was not originally their God. There is evidence of Yahweh and the worship of Yahweh in Egypt. It goes way before Yahweh starts appearing in the Jewish narrative. And also, just to point out again that ancient Israelite religion, the jury is still out on when exactly did the Jews start thinking of themselves as the Jews, and when exactly did they start even thinking about themselves in racial terms, because throughout, I mean, you look at it in Israelite religion, you look at it in the beginnings of Islam, where it's a mixture. You have Christians, you have Jews, you have people from all walks of life and all races, as we would call them today, and it's just not there in the picture. But then later on, you start seeing this reinterpretation or this revision of history, which starts involving race and all of that. So I just wanted to throw that in there and maybe also get Dr. Hemmings to comment on that and just say what you think about that.
Well, I've seen some literature on that, but I haven't gone into it in any detail. And I'm very careful in navigating the literature about Jews and Jews today. I'm very careful about that. But what was I going to say? Your last question. I was going to say something on your last statement. The question, as I did point out in my presentation, that the question as to who is a Semite is not a simple, straightforward question as we may think. All right, it's a far more complex. And your point, the point and question you raised there, and then you have a short for your name. Yeah, the question you raised there does reinforce the point that the question of who is a Semite and who is not a Semite is not as straightforward as it may appear, and there is some controversy around it today, and it's a hot mess that I'm not inclined to enter into today at all. Yeah, you could say Semite remains in language today, but you know, when you refer to Jews, you're talking about, you know, how you relate to Jews has to do with Semitism. Are you anti-Semitism? Are you anti-Semite, or, you know? So we're still talking about Jews today when we talk about Semite. And by the
Tazani
way,
did that.
Ethiopic is a Semitic language. So that goes to show the extent to which, that whole region we're talking about, it's not a simple story. If I may say, Thandazani. Do you say Thandazani? Thandazani. Did I address your question adequately? Or he's muted?
I asked him to unmute there.
You did address my thoughts, and just maybe to throw something out there also, it is powerful how once someone gets the authority to tell or control a story, there's so much they can do with that story. Yeah. And it's something that I think we all just need to keep in mind. Even as we read the biblical text, there's someone who is telling this story. Who are they? What's influencing them? And some people revise these stories, and just to keep that in mind, he who has the power to tell the story can really control a lot.
Yep. That's a subject that we probably need to deal with one of these days on this Sabbath school.
Certainly.
Who is telling this story? That's a good topic.
Thank you, Thandazani. I really appreciate your interaction with Adventist and your writing for us too. And by the way, I love that picture with you and that beautiful little girl. Tamika, are you still there?
Yes, I'm still here.
Okay, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you so much. I apologize.
That is okay. That is okay. So we've got 2 hands, well, 3 hands, including yours, Lauren. So Clarence, you're next.
Yes.
So go ahead and unmute, or you're already unmuted.
Yes, I just wanted to make a comment on the question Lauren raised, originally coming from Sherian. There's an element we need to remember. It's the economic. People who have the economic power will dominate, and the rest will be subservient. Now, when you have military and economic, then you are very strong. And Europeans, well, they came down to the Caribbean, they went to Mexico, across the Americas, and so on, and in other parts of the world. For these last 500 years, they have dominated because they had the arms, they had the firepower, and they had the money. In one country where I worked, even today, people who have the money are called white, whether they are black or brown skin or whatever. Once they have the money, they're white. That tells the whole story. It's also a very economic thing, or economical, if you want.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you for that, Clarence. Mitchum, please unmute and join our conversation.
Yes, hope you guys can hear me. It's kind of cold here in Montreal right now. One of the things I remember from my professor, Dr. Gosnell York at NCU, he was teaching a class and he was letting us know the African story, or the African stories that emanated or even involved the Bible, because the Bible is an African story if we understand the roots of where many things came from. And someone got upset saying, well, why we got to make it about race? And he said, I didn't say anything about race. I said a continent. We're looking at the continental story, which is moving upward and upward. And I think it's in the attempt to separate certain places of the world from the Bible that we sort of get this superiority complex in some parts of the world and an inferiority complex in others. And I find that even in archaeological digs, when you look at the Journal of Biblical Archaeology, the more they find out about the ancient people of the Bible, the more they see that they were more colored than they were inside of our Christian books, or that we give to our children, where we see these very Lauren Siebold-like figures being the Moseses and the saviors and the likes, whereas people that look like our our teacher, Olive, Dr. Hemmings, seem to be somewhat absent, even though the story was emanating from a culture and a place where melanin was so important for your everyday living. So I'm sorry I could have missed it because I'm just coming in, but this whole story and of this the race, which is just the human race, and the color of our skin separates us more than than anything, whereas Jesus has been trying to unite us. So thank you so much.
Yeah, Mitchum, it's me and Charlton Heston. We represent the biblical figures for you.